In the early settlement of Nova Scotia, Pictou County, especially the central part of it, seems to have been overlooked. But after the war between the English and the French ended with the taking of Quebec in 1759, many of the officers who had served in the army received grants of land in Pictou. Other grants were given to companies, speculators, on condition that they bring out settlers within a given time. There had been some French settlers here earlier, with whom the Indians were quite friendly, even fighting with them at Louisbourg in Quebec, so they looked on the English as enemies and resented their coming. The first English settlers consisted of 6 families, who came from Philadelphia in a vessel called the Hope in 1767. Among them being Dr. Harris, the agent, Robert Patterson, surveyor, later known as Squire Patterson, perhaps the most influential person among the early settlers, and one James McCabe, formerly of Belfast, Ireland, who was said to have cut down the first tree in Pictou. Doubtless the McCabes of Green Hill were descendants of his. They had been misled by stories of the new land, such as getting sugar off trees, and sadly disappointed at the dreary sight that met their eye. Not an English settler on the north shore of the province, from the Strait of Canso to the Bay of Verte, or farther, and the primeval forest down on the water's edge. The only mode of travel was by water, so they all settled near the harbor. They found 3 streams flowing into the harbor, which from their location they named East River, Middle River, and West River. And as other settlers arrived, and their place of settlement was designated by the name to the nearest river, even though their home was miles away. Although these first settlers had many privations, they were never in actual want. Some new settlers arrived from the older colonies of the south. Others went away until 1773. There were 16 families. Then came the Hector, with a party of Highlanders from Scotland. An agent, John Ross by name, had been sent to get immigrants, promising each family a free passage, a free farm lot, and a year's provisions. Many of the Highlanders were allured by the prospect of owning their own farm and embraced the opportunity. So the Hector was chartered. 3 families boarding her at Greenock, the rest at Loch Broom. In all, 33 families and 25 unmarried men. Just as they were ready to start, a piper came on aboard. The master of the ship was going to put him off, but the passengers interceded for him, saying they would share their rations with him in exchange for his music. They set sail early in July and arrived in Pictou Harbor September 15th, 1773. The Indians had been troublesome, but when the English heard of the new immigrants coming, they told the Indians that the same men they had seen in petticoats at the Battle of Quebec were coming to Pictou. The Hector had been painted in imitation of a man of war, and in celebration of their journey's end, the young men arrayed themselves in their kilts with skene duan broadswords. And as they dropped anchor, the piper blew his pipes with the utmost power. His utmost power. The Micmacs fled to the woods and never gave any trouble. They landed across the harbor from Pictou, and in memory of their homeland, they named the place Loch Broom. The sight which met their eyes was very different from what they expected. No roads of any kind except a blazed path to Truro. The land around the harbor had all been taken up, and nowhere else was a tract of cleared land to be seen. Discouraged, many of them moved to Halifax, Truro, Londonderry, and even as far away as Windsor and Cornwallis. About 70 remained, and many of the others returned later. Of those who stayed, Alexander Fraser, a native of Inverness-shire, settled on the east side of the Middle River. He being the first settler in the district, while Colin Douglas settled nearly opposite of the west side of the river. His son John, later known as Deacon Douglas. These two properties are still owned and occupied by direct descendants of the original grantees. Kenneth Fraser and family settled first at Londonderry, but later returned and took up land to the west slope and made his home in the crest of the hill. Angus Mackenzie, another Hector passenger, had gone to Windsor, but he also later returned to Green Hill. The next year, 1774, a party of lowland Scots chartered a boat and set sail from Dumfries, Prince Edward Island, then called St. John's. They were well supplied with food and clothing, but landed in the autumn and were scarcely settled when a band of traders from the older colonies who had happened to be in the harbour came ashore for a carousel. They plundered the warehouse of all it contained, then set fire to the building. On top of this, a plague of mice, so that the second winter they would have starved had it not been for a French settlement some miles distant, from which they received food, principally potatoes, in exchange for clothing they had brought with them from Scotland, until they had scarcely enough left to clothe themselves decently. Having heard there was food in Pictou, they sent one of the number to find out. His report was so favourable, they were glad to exchange total want in Prince Edward Island for a partial supply to be found in Pictou. Accordingly, in 1776, about 15 families moved over, landing at Abercrombie. About half of them settled on the West River, but Robert Marshall took up land on the east side of the Middle River, making this his home, near McCullough's Brook, since known as Horns Brook. John Smith settled on the opposite side, where Thomas Horn since lived, now owned by J.J. MacLeod, while the Crocketts and Brydens went up a little further upstream. The Blackies settled on the northern slope of Green Hill. This increase in the population made it harder for former settlers who willingly shared what they had with these who were worse off. Fish and game was plentiful, and as they got the land cleared, they had good crops, principally wheat and potatoes. As there was no mill to grind the wheat, and most of it was given in exchange for other goods, every family had a hand mill. But it was so hard to operate, and as the flour was of an inferior quality, it was only on special occasions it was used. At the time, there was not an oat mill in the whole of Nova Scotia. For some years, much of the food had been obtained from Truro. The men traveling through the forest on foot, carrying a load on their backs, or in winter on snowshoes, which the Indians had shown them how to make, and hauling a load on a hand sled. After the close of the American War in 1783 and 84, came the largest band of immigrants thus far. Most of them were disbanded soldiers who had been given a large grant of land around the shore from Fisher's Grant eastward. Among them was one Alpin Grant, who had served in the 84th Regiment, and who settled just below the town. Later, another Alpin Grant, probably a grandson, lived at Green Hill, near where the drive-in theatre is now. Two of his sisters, Mary MacDonald's brothers, Peter and Daniel. In 1788-89 came a number of lowlanders, mostly Dumfries, among whom were William Munsey, the first settler on Green Hill, on the farm still occupied by his descendant, George Munsey. Also David McCullough and Robert Sturgeon, who settled on the south side of the hill and William Porter, Middle River. The settlers were not long in the Middle River when they had need of a burying ground. So a site was selected on the hill on the east bank of the river. Here rest many pioneers of the Middle River District, and it has been in use ever since. Of the Highlanders who settled in Pictou, few could read, although most of them had Bibles, but few other books. The Dumfries settlers were more intelligent, and both were deeply religious. For years, the only teaching they had was a Bible reading on Sabbath when they would gather together, and Robert Marshall would read the English-speaking people, while Colin Douglas did the same with the Gaelic. The increase in population encouraged them to apply to Scotland for a Presbyterian minister. In the spring of 1786, their plea was granted. Reverend James Drummond MacGregor was appointed. At this time, there were no roads or bridges. A path led from the East River to the Middle River, and another from the Middle River to the West River, but there was none from either to the harbour. From Truro there was only a blazed path, but some men were engaged in making a road. This consisted merely in cutting down some of the trees and rolling the logs to one side. No attempt was made to remove the stumps or level the ground, as there were no bridges. When a traveller came to a brook, he had to follow its course upstream until he came to a suitable place to cross. This made the route much longer than it would otherwise have been. At that same point there were only 4 or 5 horses between Salmon River and Antigonish. The late John Douglas Deacon of Middle River used to tell of the first horse he ever saw. It belonged to a man from Truro who had called at his father's house. Returning home from a short absence one day, he was surprised to see a huge animal tied to a tree. Peeping from behind another tree, he was more surprised to see a strange man come out of the house, mount on his back, and ride away. To these dismal surroundings came the young Mr. MacGregor, a native of Perthshire. He was early devoted to the ministry, and having passed through his studies at Edinburgh College with credit, he studied theology and was in due time licensed to preach. He made a special study of the Highland language, and thus became an accomplished Gaelic scholar. He arrived at Halifax on July 11th, 1786, and the same week came to Truro on horseback. On the 21st he arrived at what has since been known as 10 Mile Farm, the nearest house to Truro. The following morning he was taken to the harbour in a canoe. He had expected to find a town, and was very much disappointed to find there was no place where he could see 2 houses without trees between. Next day he preached his first sermon in Pictou at Squire Patterson's barn. Word of his coming had been spread around, and people came from far and near, many whom had never heard the sermon before. Those near walked through the woods or along the shore, but the majority came by boat and canoe. The second Sabbath he preached on the East River, just below the Albion Mines, is where the Albion Mines is now. And the third Sabbath, August 6th, he preached his first sermon on the Middle River. The service was held on the east side of the river, just at the head of the tide, under a majestic elm tree, which I think still stands on Fraser's Interval. This place was chosen as the site for the first church, as being the most central, but the plan was abandoned when it was decided to build 2 churches, one on the East River and another on the West River at Loch Broom. The winter of 1786-87 was a very severe one. Snow coming in November, not melting until April or May. Mr. MacGregor found this very trying. He was not used to it. So to make less traveling, he preached 2 consecutive Sabbaths at each place and visited homes between. In the summer of 1788, His first communion service was held on the west side of the Middle River. Shaded by a steep wooded bank, the tables were spread under a large tree, which may still be seen on Douglas Interval, a short distance below Alma Bridge. This was a great occasion, as he was the only minister on the north shore of Nova Scotia, and there was not a Presbyterian minister in New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, or Cape Breton. So people came from as far away as Hants County to attend these services, which lasted from Thursday until Monday. At this time, there were 130 communicants. These services were held at the same place during 9 years that Dr. McGregor was alone. Not a drop of rain ever fell during these outdoor services. In 1795, 2 other ministers arrived just in time for the sacrament, the Reverend Duncan Ross and Reverend John Brown. Immediately after the communion session, the 3 ministers, with Robert Marshall, elder, united to form the first presbytery in all Canada, and called it Associate Presbytery of Pictou. The first meeting was held in Robert Marshall's barn. As the community assumed a settled form, we may pause to take a survey of people and conditions in the new colony. As to origin, the majority were Scottish. A few lowlanders, but many from the Highlands and speaking in Gaelic language. The Highlanders were accustomed to extreme poverty, so were well fitted to endure the difficulties of a new settlement. They readily endured hardship, but were not as eager to improve their condition as some others were. But when they were mixed with others, they could compete with their neighbors in anything. At this time, early in the 1800s, the population was scattered principally along the shore, along the banks of the rivers, where there was interval. So scattered were they that often there was a distance of 3 or 4 miles between homes. They had reached the position where they had plenty to eat. Their houses were still built of logs. Some were sparsely furnished. Some British cloth was imported, but generally people were clothed in what they made from their own wool and flax. As to their feet, all ages and both sexes carried them quite bare. What's this? Some Scottish cloth was imported, but generally people were clothed in what they made from their own wool and flax. As to their feet, all ages and both sexes carried them quite bare. When some additional covering became necessary, it was generally a pair of rawhide moccasins. A pair of shoes was a prized possession. Often when walking to church, they would carry their shoes until nearly there, and then they would stop, wash their feet in the brook, then sit down on the grass and put on their shoes and continue the journey. A woman who arrived in 1795 attended the sacrament wearing a pair of good shoes. When she was told to take good care of them, as she would never see another pair, in spite of all their hardships and exposure, the people were generally very healthy. Infant mortality was rare and tuberculosis was unknown. Store luxuries were very little used. One man remarked, "We bought a pound of tea. It cost 8 shillings, but it did us for 8 years." As they began to keep stock, they were troubled by wild animals, particularly bears, some of them being large enough to attack a cow. When killed, the carcass often weighed 500 or 600 weight. Then trouble assailed from another direction. In 1815 came what is known as the Year of the Mice. Coming in the spring, they destroyed the growing crops, even the potatoes in the ground. In a grain field, they cut the stem so that it fell down, and then they ate the grain. So large and fierce were they that they would even defy the cat. In the autumn, As the weather grew colder, they sickened and died, their carcasses being so numerous a person could not walk without stepping on them. They have never been so numerous since. The next year, 1816, was known as the year without summer. In the woods, the ground was hard and frozen in June. The ground was not fit for cultivation until very late, and what little crops were put in were destroyed by early frost. I have heard it said there was only 1 month in the year without frost, this coming just after the mice reduced the settlers to hard lines. What food was to be got was very expensive, flour being about $15 a barrel in Halifax. But we have never had 2 such hard years in succession since. Now attention began to be given to better roads, and it was quite natural that the first roads should follow the line of the blazed paths. And as the low ground was found to be swampy and boggy and unsafe for travel, the path always followed was the highest land, avoiding the hollows as much as possible. Thus the first road from the Middle River to West River went over Green Hill, the route still used by mail courier on Westville RR number 1. The first bridges were just a log felled across a brook, and later 2 or 3 logs with upper side hewn flat. And if the stream was too wide for that, an abutment of tree logs was built at either side, and long logs lay between. The first bridge across Middle River was built in 1803. Previously, a bridge had been built across McCullough's Brook. As it was ordered to be repaired in 1804, the road around the south side of Green Hill, now forming part of Provincial Highway number 4, was not built until 1850. For many years, this was known as the New Road, while the one over Green Hill was the Old Road. In the meantime, schools were being built, and the old school at Alma was just opposite Deacon Douglas, while the one at Green Hill was on the rise of ground to the east of the present building and still known as Schoolhouse Hill. For a long time, the nearest church was at the West River, but in 1849, Fort Salem Church was built in Green Hill and served the country for miles around. Here the first minister, Reverend George Patterson, a native of Pictou and a grandson of Dr. McGregor. Later, he was known as Dr. Patterson, noted historian and author. This is his first and only charge. He labored faithfully and well for 27 years, and here he preached his last sermon. In the early days, the mail was brought from Halifax to Pictou in a small schooner or packet. About 1815, Jacob Linz began carrying it from Truro by horse and chaise. After a few years, this was changed to a double-seated wagon capable of carrying 3 or 4 passengers and drawn by 2 horses, making the trip once a week. In 1828, a company was formed called the Eastern Stagecoach Company to run a line of coaches between Halifax and Pictou. About 1842, Hiram Hyde purchased the establishment, used a covered coach, 6 or more horses, and made a daily trip. For a time, the coach also ran to New Glasgow when they changed horses at Granny Marshall's, near R.G. Ross's home. Is now, or R.G. Ross's home is now. This continued until the building of the railroad, about the time of Confederation. About this time, the post offices began to be opened in rural districts. The Green Hill had named itself from its height and its verdant color, which could be seen miles away. The lower district had been known just as Middle River. This would not do for the name of a post office, as it might mean any place between Lochbroom and Lansdowne. This was shortly after the close of the Crimean War. When the victory gained at the Battle of Alma was still fresh in people's memory, so the name Alma was chosen. The first postmaster was Silas Archibald, who kept the office in his own house. After his death, the office was taken over by A.H. Fraser and was later attended by his son. At Greenhill, the post office was for a long time in charge of Mrs. Jessie Mackenzie, who also kept a general store where McCunn's Garage is now. Another early merchant was James MacDonald, whose store was opposite the Greenhill Schoolhouse. The first merchant in Alma was James McCabe. When he moved away, his father Alexander McCabe took over the business and later sold it to A.H. Fraser. While just opposite James McGregor, Fraser also kept the store for a time. Although this has always been an agricultural district, many of the farmers specializing in dairying, yet there have been other industries at various times. Among the first was a sawmill and a grist mill owned by Archibald Brothers and situated on the east side of the river, just above the bridge. The large house at the end of the bridge was built for boarding house to accommodate the employees. The property was later purchased by George Conley, who operated an axe factory